Okay. So thank you all for joining this morning in this virtual roundtable tribute to Dave Rohde. Not only his career, but also Dave Rohde as a man. I'm the chair. I'm Sean Theriault. I'm from the University of Texas. I'm so pleased to have a fantastic set of roundtable participants. So we're actually going to go in the reverse order of when they met Dave. But first, I'm going to take the chair's prerogative and just talk a bit about Dave before I introduce the fellow roundtable participants. So it's important to know that Dave got his PhD from Rochester in 1971. He was born in Buffalo, so he just went down the road to Rochester. And Rochester at that particular moment was at a real moment, right? So it had the dual influences of Dick Fenno and Bill Riker. And so they were turning out a whole bunch of really good political scientists who you're going to be hearing, some of whom you're going to be hearing from a little bit later. And Dave, shortly after starting his job at Michigan State. So Dave, I'm not sure how you started your job before you got your PhD, but we can save that for later in the roundtable.
I know.
He started, he started at MSU in 1970, got his PhD in 1971, and then was an APSA fellow from 1972 to 1973. He stayed at Michigan State up until 2005 when he moved to Duke for all those years except one, when he went to the University of Florida for a year. Dave has, right, it's hard to count the number of books Dave has published because it's 5 by 1 count, plus there's 18 at least iterations of changing continuity. And I should confess that I'm getting a lot of these data from his last CV that was updated on Duke's webpage that I think ended in 2017. So these are undercounts in every way. At that point, at least, he had 101 articles or chapters in edited books. And perhaps equally impressive, he had 48 different co-authors, many of whom I'm so pleased are joining us this morning. Dave, of course, has played tons of different service roles inside the profession. He was both the president and the program chair for the Southern Political Science Association. But I think perhaps where he had his greatest influence in service to the profession was as the director of PIPSI, which is a program that he started in 1994 at Michigan State. And then he moved it to Duke when he went to Duke. And I know that I'm looking at many people who participated in various activities associated with PIPSI. Of course, it was transformative for the graduate students with whom he worked in PIPSI, but even to those outside of the school to where Dave was currently teaching, benefited tremendously from the PIPSI programs. Dave famously has a year-end book conference, which would be taking place in about a month or so, where he invites someone who has a manuscript somewhere between 75 and 95% done. At least they think it's that far done until they go to the week-long PIPSI book workshop, where the author gets 4 days of presentations where they break up their book into various chunks. And then on the 5th day, he and John and 2 of their graduate students would always comment and tell you all of the things that you needed to do to your book in order to get it ready for publication. And I am pleased to say that I was the beneficiary of this book conference twice for my book on party polarization in Congress, and then just a couple of years ago for the book that I worked on with Michelle Wyman and Brian Jones called The Great Broadening. So Dave has had a tremendous influence not only in scholarship, also in service to the profession, but perhaps where he, I think, is going to make his biggest mark is when you know Dave the person. We, of course, have this expression that you're supposed to fake it until you make it. And when I was a baby professor at the University of Texas, I tried faking it until I made it. And then I realized that a simple phone call to Dave or a drink at one of the professional conferences, I didn't need to fake it because he would just tell me. He would give me his advice. He would give me his counsel. And it saved me from hitting my head up against the wall time and time again. It's right. I was so pleased to have this roundtable for Dave, but it also makes me tremendously sad because I think that since 1998, when I was in my 3rd or 4th year at Stanford, I've been meeting up with Dave at just about every single Midwest and every single APSA. And what I was guaranteed in my meetings with Dave was usually, well, always good food, great wine, and engaging and interesting conversation. And so much of my professional conferences has been wrapped up into those meetings with Dave, and I'm just going to miss them so much. But I'm so grateful that, that I feel like my relationship with him has transformed from a professional one to a personal one, because I have been welcomed into their house. Both Dave and Barb have been fantastic hosts to both me and Anthony. And I was really grateful when last January, when the Southern was in Austin, and I could welcome them into my condo in Austin. And so I know that I know that this is a transition in Dave's life, but I hope this is not a transition in my relationship with him. And with that, I will first I'll introduce the roundtable participants, and then I will let them speak for about 10 minutes or so. And we're first going to go with Danielle Thomsen, who knows Dave from doing a postdoc at Duke for a couple of years, and a pre-doc too, right, Danielle?
Yep, 1 year.
Yep. And I'm so grateful for Danielle, because she is getting up on California time to join us. And so we're so grateful to have her here. Second speaking today is going to be Wendy Schiller. Of course, Wendy also graduated from the University of Rochester at Brown now. And Wendy, your book, Partners and Rivals, went through
Yes.
the PIPSI workshop.
No, it didn't go through the PIPSI workshop. It went through Dave Rohde's comments at conferences and, you know, drinks at conferences and some, you know, we have a long history. He was very gracious. He's always read a lot of my stuff. So I didn't do that with him.
Right.
We did it at William and Mary with Larry Evans, but nonetheless, my dissertation went through a couple of rounds with David Rohde. So that was a good start for me.
And then we skip a couple of years to get to Dave's colleagues at the University of Rochester. And nicely, they each arrived in 3 successive years. And so the person who met Dave when Dave was a second year is John Aldrich, who I think has co-authored a thing or two with Dave over the course of their careers. And then speaking fourth will be Mo Fiorina. Right, Mo, you were the year after Dave, or John was 2 years after Dave. You were 1 year after Dave.
1 year after David.
Yep. And then someone who was already at Rochester before Dave showed up is Ken Shepsle. And so he's going to be batting, I mean, I should say cleanup, except that he's fifth, but he's the last one. So he will be our last. And then we thought that it was only right that Dave get a few moments to then have a few words at the end of this. And we're so grateful for so many people for showing up that at the end of that, I want each of you to have a turn to talk about Dave in this his roundtable tribute. So with that, I'll turn it over to Danielle.
Great. So just to go back, I'm Danielle Thomsen, assistant professor at the University of California, Irvine. I first want to thank Sean for organizing this panel. It is truly an honor to be here today with such an esteemed group of scholars. I was actually supposed to be at the PIPSI book workshop this year, and one of the most disappointing things happened for all of this for me was that had to be canceled. But I'm so happy to have the opportunity to be here with you all and to celebrate Dave's work and contributions. So I first met Dave 9 years ago in 2011, though it's hard to believe that it's been that long. I went to Duke to spend a year there while I was a graduate student at Cornell. I completely lucked out that Dave Rohde and John Aldrich took me in, guided and shaped my work, invited me back 2 years later as a postdoc, and have continued to be hugely important mentors to me since. So I'm going to first talk about Dave's research and then talk about how his mentorship has influenced me more broadly. One of the benefits of going first on this panel is that I'm going to start with, probably as most of you would expect, parties and leaders in the post-reform house. I'm probably not the best person to talk about CPG, given the makeup of the panel, but the main contribution of this book was to introduce the theory of conditional party government, which predicts that party leaders are stronger when their internal coalitions are more homogeneous and when the two parties are further apart in their views. Conversely, rank and file members are less likely to delegate power to party leaders when intra-party preferences are more diverse and when the two parties are more similar. These two conditions explain variation in the strength of party leaders over time and why congressional leaders became increasingly strong in the late 20th century. Writing in a context when the conventional wisdom was that party leaders were weak, Rohde not only challenged this notion, but also provided a broader conceptual framework that could be applied over time and across institutions. I read this book in my first year of graduate school and again before I went to Duke. I was in the early stages of my dissertation research, and Parties and Leaders was formative in helping me to think about how leaders today not only have carrots and sticks to reward and punish members, but also influence the kinds of individuals who run for office and thus shape the future direction of the party as well. I think my story of how parties and leaders impacted me is a reflection of the fact that big ideas like CPG spark so many new questions, new puzzles, and new extensions and applications to any and all readers. That is not only the mark of an important book, which Parties and Leaders obviously is, but also of a scholar who generously opens the door to a variety of paths and encourages readers to build on his ideas in different ways. This leads me to another article of Dave's that had a huge influence on me and so many others, Risk-Bearing and Progressive Ambition. This article provides a theoretical foundation for the study of progressive ambition that is as relevant today as it was in 1979. Rather than just looking at those who run for office, he leverages the non-runners to predict the factors that influence the decision to run for a Senate seat or governorship. Rohde assumes that House members have progressive ambition and instead focuses on the utility of running for office, taking into account the value of the higher office as well as the value of their current one, their likelihood of winning, and additionally demonstrating the importance of whether members are risk-taking. The study of political ambition has had a resurgence in recent years, and Rohde 1979 continues to be a bedrock in the literature. Like Parties and Leaders, the article introduced a novel and important argument at the time, but it also inspired so many more studies and paved the way for future generations of scholars. Scholars of Congress, parties, elections, as well as gender and politics. I think this is a really crucial aspect of Dave's work and part of what makes his contributions so far-reaching and able to stand the test of time. Even the model of the political institutions and public choice program, affectionately referred to as PIPSI by all of us who have been associated with it, is about coming together to create ideas and make them better, to build bonds and friendships, and to pay it forward. This model allows for other interests to shine through too, and I enjoyed our conversations about wine, food, the Carolina Tiger Center, and the year's best movies as much as our conversations about congressional elections. I did try to talk with Dave about games once, but I play games like Apples to Apples, and I quickly realized these games are very different from the games that are played at game conventions. Now I want to say a bit about the lessons I have learned from Dave and how he has helped and supported me over the last 9 years. Dave most certainly leads by example. He's in the office every day, except for now, and creates the kind of environment that fosters intellectual creativity as well as persistence. He asks guiding questions, but encourages students to develop their own books, their own arguments, and their own way. Dave is supportive, yet he is also honest and sincere. When I was a postdoc, PIPSI generously sponsored another book workshop for me. There are two moments from the workshop that make me smile when I think back and illustrate Dave's character more generally. First, I received very positive feedback on my manuscript from the participants, thanks to you, Sean. And I remember saying to Dave afterward that it was hard to tell if everyone really meant it or not. And he looked at me like I had two heads, and he said that people don't really say that if they don't mean it. The second moment was when I said that it was such a fun experience for me, and I couldn't believe that everyone took time out of their schedules to come and discuss my book. And Dave simply replied that it's fun for them too. In fact, I'm sure most of us here have seen the Dar Williams quote at the end of Dave's signature line in his email. For those of you who have not, it says, and where does magic come from? I think magic's in the learning. And that's Dave, a curious scholar in person who not only enjoys the quest for knowledge, but also invites, encourages, and inspires new ideas in others as well. Dave has continued to be a champion of me and my research in the years since, and has guided me through professional questions, large and small. Dave's research has changed the course of congressional scholarship over the last 50 years, both upending it and then becoming the conventional wisdom. His work will continue to inspire students and scholars for decades to come. I think Dave is eager for this next journey, which will probably be filled with strategy games, war history books, big California red wines, and hopefully some newspaper clippings still too. I speak for many others when I thank him for his intellectual contributions and the countless other ways he has shaped my journey as well. Thank you, Dave.
Thank you, Danielle.
Thanks so much for that, Danielle. And now we'll have Wendy Schiller.
Okay, hi everybody. I'm going to talk about the journey because I've now going into my 26th year as a professor this summer at Brown University, and so coming from Rochester and then some detours through Brookings and Princeton, but generally going straight to Brown and talking about now at this point in my career what the people that I worked with when I was younger and just first coming out, and along the way, how they behaved and what responsibility we have as sort of mid-career, if not senior career academics, particularly in this time, this particular time of politics and this particular time in American history. And you have to sort of say to yourself, you know, who do I want to emulate? Who do I want to be like? Who do I want to model not only my ideas, my work, my framework after, but also just my academic generosity and my academic leadership after. And of course, there are a number of people who are participating in this panel who I would want to do that for, but Dave Rohde in particular stands out to me from the very beginning of my career to now. And then even though he's going in retirement, you know, he's not going to be hiding. I'm still going to be able to reach out to him. But I gave my first conference paper at APSA in 1993 in September, and it was on why senators choose to sponsor bills and which bills they sponsor, and is there some pattern to that, and can we attribute institutional effects to that? And when I first started to look at this question, I had some pretty good backing from a guy who knows something about Congress, Dick Fenno, and somebody who knows something about quantitative methods, Lara Bartels and Linda Powell, but there wasn't a whole lot of work done on this subject matter, and it seemed a little obscure and maybe, you know, boutique-ish, maybe not the best career move, but nonetheless, I persevered and I really cared about it, so I wanted to do it, and I have my timer on, so I'm not going to go long today. And so I did it. I wrote this paper and I got the data, and in those days I input it by hand. It's kind of crazy. This generation would never even understand what that looked like. And I went to APSA and I looked on my program, and I had, of course, just a year earlier, whatever, finished reading Parties and Leaders in the Post-Reform House, which I had the pleasure, by the way, of reading again about a month ago in my American Pro seminar that I'm teaching this semester to the graduate students for preparation for their comps, and spending the whole class on that book, which was as fun as it was the first time I read it. And Danielle, it's great because in their Pressy papers that I asked them to write, I asked them to actually summarize that book exactly as you summarized it. And some of them got it. Some of them had to do a little work on it. So I remember reading that book and thinking two things. One was, wow, this is great. There are no numbers in this book. There are no regression tables I have to decipher after many, many courses at Rochester on it. And I thought, wow, this is actually, I can breathe. I can read this. And then at the end, the last chapter, I thought, by the time, 3 years later, when I look back on it, I thought, this is predicting something here. This, especially that last chapter, even thinking about Newt Gingrich in the last chapter, shout out to Sean and Dave on their work on Newt Gingrich, but just the whole sort of personification of the idea of homogeneous preferences and how that will play out on the campaign trail is presaged in that last chapter in that book. It's just like he calls it exactly right for predicting 1994. So I never forgot that. But flash forward and I look at the list and I think, David Rohde is my discussant at APSA for my very first paper, the hallmark of my dissertation. And I was like, this could be rough. And then Dan Palazzo, who had just come out a couple of years ago, he was the co-discussant at that time. And I was really, honestly, I was totally petrified. And I had a dear friend in the profession. Some of you may have met her. Fiorina McGilvery was my best friend, and she kept pumping me up and saying, "It's going to be fine. I hear he's not that bad," meaning not that mean in the Rochester way, in the Wednesday afternoon Rochester seminar way. And I said, this is going to be awful. And I got there and I gave the paper and I gave my, standard OLS regression, and things were significant. And I had institutional effects and I had re-election effects on numbers of bills sponsored and types of bills sponsored. And he proceeded to give me phenomenally good and constructive criticism on how to proceed. He recognized that this was a dissertation project, and he was not overly flattering, but he was not harshly critical. And I thought these are great ideas, and I implemented them to go on to finish as I was completing the dissertation, and certainly getting that article out for review and publication. And I never forgot that style. I thought, he could do anything here. He could destroy me. He could be dismissive. He could be, specious and not, not particularly substantive. But he was literally the perfect discussant for a younger and a woman coming into the field, which was dominated by then, with the exception of a few people, Linda and Barbara and Linda Fowler and Diana Evans and Christine DeGregorio, like not really a lot more women than that. So I thought, that's the way I always want to be. I want to be that discussant. I want to be that mentor. I want to be that academic. And of course, we all dream of being that prominent, but nonetheless, it set the tone for me for 26 years moving forward. And I never forgot it. I sought his advice out. He ended up being on panels in the future on other work, particularly Partners and Rivals. We were at conferences together, and he always was straight on. This is interesting. This isn't. This is persuasive. This isn't. This is something that can be generalized. This isn't. And stuck to his frame, but always in an intellectually sophisticated way. If this doesn't fit into the frame that I think it should, I may or may not dismiss it, but I'm going to encourage you to be more rigorous in how you present it. And I think that's just a role model that can't be beat. And I think it was, I think Dave knows, but doesn't quite know how instrumental that style of commentary, that style of critique, that style of mentorship has been to so many people, not just people who publish the same way or believe the same thing or accept the same framework. So it's a phenomenal impact to have in a consistent way over time. And I think we can all just aspire to do that. And then a couple of years later, flash forward, I'm at the Midwest. I think Fiona and I were sharing a room. We were hanging out, doing that whole, you're young, you have a job, but you haven't gone up for tenure yet, but you can still cruise through the lobby of the Palmer House and know enough people, but you're not anybody who comes to talk to you yet. You're not of that stage. And we're walking through to do something. And then Dave was waiting probably to meet John or somebody, or Ken or somebody else, and just hang out there. And we caught his attention, and he said, "Hey, how you doing?" And we started to chat, and Fiona was sort of hanging back. And then we walked away, and she said, "Well, now you've made it." And I said, "What do you mean?" She said, "Dave Rohde singled you out to talk to you in the Midwest Palmer House. It's just not going to get better than that." So I thought, wow, okay, I can accept that. I accept that premise. And I never forgot that moment either. And I think as we all move forward, I have 2.5 minutes left, thinking not just about those kinds of personal mentorships, but the fact is that you can apply, create, and perpetuate rigorous social science. You do all that. You can have frameworks that work for other people in other contexts, in other countries, and you can do all that and still keep your eye on what is happening on the ground. How does your view and your work fit in to help explain trends in American politics over time, on what individuals do, what parties do, what institutions do, exogenous, endogenous, whatever the case? Dave Rohde has, sort of blazed the path of being able to do those things simultaneously, and allowing us, particularly in American politics and Congress field, to be Congress, junkies or jockettes and jocks, and be proud of that, and also know that we can still achieve rigorous social science at the same time. And I think that's just been a phenomenal standard of leadership, and I think it will continue to influence generations to come. So I'm very proud to be part of this panel today, and I want to just say my deepest thanks to Dave.
Thank you, Wendy.
Thanks, Wendy, for those kind words about Dave. We'll next turn to John Aldrich, who has shared a lifelong research agenda with Dave.
Thanks, Sean. Thanks so much for putting this together. You've done yeoman's job even in the panic of the last of the opening of this. This is great. It's really nice that Barb and Maggie and Jenny are here. Hi. And a lot of you. It's really nice. As you may have noticed from me, but also Mike's background, which is now there were T-shirts. There were T-shirts that were meant to go out, but yes. Thanks, Jason. There's the background. Here's the backside. It's the Rohde farewell tour. I still have them for all of you who were participants. So someday mail will be able to go out from here in a way to you. I'm sorry about that. Yeah, so Dave and I have, it's been a career-long collaboration in very many ways. Some of the important things we did together included bridge, poker, wine, a gazillion lunches, fortunately a lot of dinners, including the what was referred to as the Fenno dinner before, and on occasion even political science. I thought I'd start off by saying that there were three lessons that I wanted. Three lessons that Dave brought to me, and then I'll talk about two things that we've done together that I want to say something about. The first lesson is that life is interesting. It's interesting in a lot of ways, and you should enjoy as many of them as possible. If there's a person who has more, I don't know what we call them, hobbies that are not hobbies, life's passions, it's Dave. And that leads to the second lesson, which is if you find something you like, do it fully, do it deeply. And that's Dave's life that I observed. And the idea of this retirement is to be able to do the fully and deeply on things that have had to be enjoyed only with much more time than I would have ever been able to devote to them. But he's going to go even further. The third, and I think it's the most important lesson, is have deep and warm friendships for a lifetime, starting with your family. Those are the three lessons that I've picked up from Dave. I'm going to talk about two things we did together professionally. Both of them things that Dave asked me to join him in. It's worked out so well to be able to join with him together. The first is one that most of you probably don't know a whole lot about, which is that when we were at Michigan State together, we developed a course on campaigns and elections in the undergraduate level together, and taught it together. At the time, we didn't have all the online stuff that we could to check, so we may not have checked as deeply as you would have today, but we couldn't find another campaigns and elections course. That's the end of the sentence. There wasn't any that we could find that anybody had taught, so we kind of developed it on our own and taught it together. The reason I mention this, besides reminding you that of this, is that it allows me to report what George Vanberg, our chair and Rochester alumnus, just sent around to the department, which is that Dave was just recognized this month for, quote, receiving undergraduate course evaluations in the top 5% of the social sciences at Duke University last semester, based on teaching American politics. I think that was the key course that got him to get that. we think of Dave as a professional political science through his research. I just wanted to emphasize there was also teaching, teaching in addition to mentoring, to teaching in the traditional sense. I thought I'd say a couple of words about conditional party government for a reason you'll see in a minute. We'd been working on it separately, individually for about, I don't know, 2 decades before we started. It's just hard to believe, but before we started working on it together, and that's been several decades too. The reason I wanted to bring this up, besides it's an important part of Dave's political science, of course, is I can talk a little bit about what Dave claims to be his last paper, which is a paper we were writing for the now Dodd, Oppenheimer, and Evans Congress Reconsidered, the chapter on the House. This paper has a long period. It's a long period of the House that we cover from about 1953 on. It turns out we weren't working on CPG from 1953 on, but almost as long, it seems like, together. Sometimes we are criticized, or our project is criticized in part by CPG having a shifting grounds over time. I think it's not the case. I think it's the same theory. It's the empirical world that shifts and gives us a light to shine on different parts of it, and therefore insights on different parts of understanding Congress and American democracy. This long period has allowed us to do, what do I have here? Sorry, it goes on that page. 3 things. Discover 3 things. One of them, which I think is probably the most important, is that it gave a large number of instances in which the theory could stand to a particular testing, which is the testing of the shift of at least the speaker from one speaker to the other, if not a shift from not only the speaker, but of the majority party. This opened up the opportunity for the new speaker and new majority party, and was be then what's the change. Sometimes they actually seem to mean it for about, a month before they quit returning to regular order and continue on in strengthening the party's control agenda. So that's one thing that we had the opportunity, especially recently with so many switches of speakers in majority parties, that we've had a chance to look at what actually happens when there's a good chance of test. Second thing is that it allowed us to appreciate a deepening of various goals of members. And the most important one that we could point to is considering the value to members of holding the House majority. Sometimes I dabble in political psychology, and my former student, Wendy Schiller, liked to say, if you do political psychology, you always have an N of 1 yourself. Well, we don't have an N of 1 for members of Congress. We do have an N of 1 for a Duke political science professor who's a member of Congress. And so we get to talk to Dave Price every once in a while. And that was a clear demonstration of the value of being in the majority rather than the minority party in the House, as he would talk about his ambitions about the House, dramatically different. The third and final thing, and I'll shut up, is that the third thing it allowed us to do was that after a generally very close correspondence between the 2 parts of the conditions of conditional party government, the homogeneity within the majority party and the differentiation between the majority and the minority party. For a very long time, the correspondence was very high. They were very closely correlated, and you had both things happening at the same time, which we typically refer to as partisan polarization. But more recently, we've had the opportunity to observe relative high degrees of partisan polarization with increasing diversity of opinions within the majority party, so that we have a separation then between the two conditions, and we could see such things as we think it helps us conditional party government helps us understand things like the growth of the right wing of the Republican Party through the Tea Party and the House Freedom Caucus. On a side note on that, in addition, there's a sort of demonstration of a difference between not just policy positions, because there are other people who were just as conservative as, say, the Freedom Caucus, that didn't cause the same disruption within the majority party as they did. So a difference in more than just policy goals in terms of what they think of as doing good public policy. And then now with the majority, with the Democratic majority, the growth has been increasing diversity, but a diversity of relative balance between strengthening both the moderate wing and the liberal progressive wing. And it has given us an opportunity to observe Nancy Pelosi's speakership and her ability to balance, to contain the diversity through the support of the caucus, but also her adroitness as speaker. And so in this last paper, if you will, which I'm still hopeful I could convince it it's not really going to be the last paper, but we'll see. But in this last paper, it allows us then to have explored conditional party government at a much wider range of empirical terrain than we would have if we'd have stopped working on it a decade ago or so. All I can say from that is my career has been shaped by Dave's bringing me in on projects, hopefully by me bringing Dave in some projects. I don't know exactly how things are going to go in the future. I'm not sure what I'm going to do about lunch. We almost always have lunch together. Maybe I'll start brown bagging, I don't know. But it's going to be a different, fortunately, he's going to be here physically, and hopefully we can continue to have a long, productive, and enjoyable friendship together. Thank you, Dave.
Thank you, John.
Next up is Mo Fiorina.
Okay, I'm unmuted. Good. I think David was the first graduate student I met when I went to Rochester. I remember there was a big public room for the graduate students, and David had appropriated one corner of this room, and he was there pretty much all the time, all daylight hours. He only left that corner to join the card games that were always going on in the middle of the room. We were using applied game theory in these games, of course. And David, what he spent his time doing, I don't know if a lot of younger people don't know that, but David was at that point a Supreme Court scholar. And so David was coding, as Wendy mentioned earlier, he had yellow sheets and pencils and books, and he was coding, scaling Supreme Court decisions. And I'm glad he got out of that business. Not that that work wasn't worthwhile, because I think the work he did later was more significant, especially the work on conditional party government, which has deeply informed my own work in recent years. We spent a lot of time together in graduate school. I looked to Dave and Ken as my role models. We can praise Ken on some other occasion. But David introduced me to German wine, to roller coasters. I wouldn't ride them, but my wife rode them with him. We went to, what was it, Buffalo or something, or Toronto? I can't remember, on one occasion. I'm going to use my time to tell a story of the one collaboration we engaged in graduate school. In Dick Fenno's seminar, we read Nelson Polsby's articles on institutionalization and seniority, And like all Rochester students at the time, we found them flawed in data, analysis, logic, et cetera. And so we set out, in particular in the measures of turnover, we noticed that, for example, Nelson had simply coded first-term members and didn't take account of the increasing size of the House. So the new members coming in, of course, weren't turnover. And also there was a lot of rotation going on in the 19th century where people would come back and forth. And so we spent months, David and I and Pete Whistle, many six-packs of beer, would just rotate from one apartment to another with the biographical directory of the American Congress, really pinning down who came back, who didn't come back. And we did some other things, and we wrote it up and added some other criticisms of Polsby, and then we sent it off to the APSR. Polsby was the editor of the APSR at that time. But we figured, well, what the heck, he's going to find it difficult to reject a paper that criticizes his work. I can see David laughing now, it's coming back. Well, we didn't know Polsby. And this was the quickest turnaround we ever got. It was 1 week, one sheet of paper arrived in the mail. And the sheet read, I have appointed myself the referee for your paper. What you lose in anonymity, you gain in expertise. I'm rejecting your paper. I think it's a lousy job. I've kept this over the years. It's all yellowed now. I show it to junior people who have had a stinging review, and I say, you haven't gotten anything like this in your career. You want a hard review, take a look at this. So I'm sorry we didn't have much chance to collaborate after that, but I treasure the years I spent with David, not enough time, but I look forward to some continual meetings at APSA and again, dinners and wine.
Thanks, Brent. I think that's helpful advice for anyone who's received those rejection letters. And someone who's never received a rejection letter will go last, Ken Shepsle.
All right, I think I've unmuted myself. Can people hear me? Good. First of all, it is great to see everybody. I think the memory I will always have of the coronavirus is knowing people as tiles on my computer screen. And it's great to see everybody. It's like, I feel the same way with my students when I Zoom a graduate seminar and see them on the screen. I never enjoyed teaching so much as I do in getting to see people. I think it's a function of being locked in for too long. In any case, Barbara, it's great to see you. Barbara and David and my wife Risa and I share something very precious. Namely, we share August 26, 1967. Both of us were married on that day. Barb and Dave in Buffalo, New York, Risa and me in Washington, D.C. We didn't know each other as couples then. We have come for 53 years to become close friends. Jenny and Maggie, it's great to see you again. My gosh, it's been a long time. And I am reminded of the fact that Jenny was born on, I think, October 31st, 1969.
Yes.
Something like that. Because the next day, Risa and I were in Highland Hospital, riding up the elevator with Dave to see the new mother and baby. And Dave reported that that Jenny was 6'9" when she was born. And I said, geez, is that tall? But anyway, it's great to see all of you. So let me start with the fact that I started graduate school at Rochester in 1966. Am I being heard by everyone? Yes?
Yeah.
In 1966. And in the spring of 67, the new admits would come through Rochester taking a look at us. And one of them was this guy, Dave Rohde. And I wish I had a picture of David then, because if you put it up against the picture of David we see now, he has just not changed at all. He is the Dorian Gray of political science, I think. It's amazing, David, how your blonde hair and your blonde facial hair have marked you for all of these 53 years. You look exactly the same. I wish I could say the same for the rest of us. In any event, we became good friends at that time. As Mo said, there was room 307 in Harkness Hall at the University of Rochester, where the graduate students hung out, and David did commandeer the desk in the corner, and there were card games going on in the center, and one of them in particular was a 3-person card game, which are fairly unusual, called Sergeant Major. And we would play that incessantly because it was a coalition game. And so we could, as Mo suggested, do applied game theory in forming coalitions in a card game that was bonded all of us. And the longest running Sergeant Major game at the highest altitude was a game that Mo and John Aldrich and David and John Aldrich and I played on a flight to San Francisco for the 1973 APSA meetings. So we played it at, I think, 35,000 feet. The one project that David and I did jointly together involved committee assignments. I had taken Dick Fenno's seminar on Congress, I think the year before Dave did. And when I took it, I wrote a paper on committee assignments. I still have a copy of the paper. Dick gave me an A-, said very interesting. And there were a bunch of regressions in the paper, regressing congressman district characteristics on likelihood of a congressman landing on a committee. And Dick told me, and subsequently Dave, that through John Manley, he had 4 Congresses worth of preference orderings of congressmen, freshmen mainly, for committee assignments. And Dave and I were extremely interested. And Dick said that if we have, he and John Manley had not used them by June of, I think, 1970, that he would let Dave and me have them. And so on June 1st, 1970, I can see it now, Dave and I standing at the corner office on the 3rd floor of Harkness Hall, knocking on Dick Fenno's door saying, "It's June 1st and you haven't used them, give us that data." And with it, we wrote an APSA paper that became an APSR paper. At that point, when it came out in 1973, I think, David had been a congressional fellow. He had deserted me in my project on committee assignments for greener pastures with Norm Ornstein and Bob Peabody studying the Senate. So he left the committee assignment business to me, and I pursued it, of course, during that period. But anyway, Dave moved on to bigger and better things. Not many people remember the fact that he was one of the early, he and Ornstein and Peabody were one of the early collaborative projects on the US Senate. Most of the Congress literature was very House-centric. Let me just tell one or two other stories, I guess, and yield the remainder of my time back to the chair. Duke's recruitment of Rohde, I played an essential part in. I don't even know if Dave remembers it, but I was the chair of the Harvard Government Department, and we had voted senior offers to Jim Stimson at Chapel Hill and John Aldrich at Duke. And we were trying to recruit both of them. And I told the dean that I was going to fly to North Carolina and take Jim Stimson and his wife out to dinner one night, and John and Cindy Aldrich out to dinner the next night. And before I arrived, John called me and somewhat awkwardly, Aldrich called me and somewhat awkwardly said, "You know, we're trying to recruit Dave Rohde at Duke, and it's a football weekend, and there are no hotel rooms available in Chapel Hill or Durham. You have a hotel room." John remembered that Dave and I would share hotels at APSA meetings. He said, "Would you mind sharing the room with Dave?" Now here I am coming to Duke to recruit Aldrich, and he is asking me to help him recruit Rohde to Duke. And of course I did. I did not tell my dean that I had, but nevertheless, this is the only reason why Dave is now at Duke University. I would say one other personal thing, which has been mentioned by some of the other people, and that is Dave is one of the founding members of the Fenno dinner. 5 of us, Fiorina, Aldrich, Shepsle, Rohde, and Fairjohn, would take Dick Fenno to dinner at APSA every year. And even for about 10 or 15 years after Dick stopped coming to APSA, we thought about calling it the Fenno List Dinner, but we still call it the Fenno Dinner. And Dave is one of the founding members and member in good standing. I teach a graduate seminar in Congress every other year with Jim Snyder, and on Wednesday we taught conditional party government. So it's a nice coincidence that we're having this roundtable. The students love the theory, by the way, so you're still in good shape, Dave. I think the greatest disappointment of my association with Dave over the years has been having to learn the names of Republicans in the House of Representatives. I mean, all of our careers, we thought the Democrats were the permanent majority, and we never had to learn any Republican names. So that was the biggest disappointment, I think. So let me conclude by saying that Dave and I started our professional careers in July of 1970. David at MSU, me at Washington University. I retire on June 30th of this year, David on July 31st of this year, both of us 50 years later. Our graduate student colleagues, whom we've remained close to throughout our lives and their lives, include Barb Sinclair, Mo Fiorina, John Aldrich, Dick McKelvey, Peter Aronson, and others. It's been quite a ride, David, quite a ride. I raise my glass to you in appreciation for a long lifetime of good experience.
Thank you, Ken.
I can't be the only one that was concerned that Ken was going to raise a wine glass, am I? And now we'll give the man his due. So Dave, it's your turn.
Well, I guess the first thing is how grateful I am to all of you, especially Sean and Danielle for organizing this. And Danielle spent so much time organizing a dinner at which was supposed to and of course that too was canceled in that, but and for all of the participants, the panelists, for taking the time out to do this. It's been wonderful and much less of a roast than the term that Sean used than I expected. And I was really quite amazed that Professor Shepsle going last did not renew his charge that I was personally to blame for all the things that went wrong in Congress from the reform era over the next couple of decades because of the authorship of the Subcommittee Bill of Rights. I'm grateful. Thank you for not renewing your charge. And to all the other people who tuned in, I'm really delighted that Maggie and Jenny and Barb got a chance to not just see this later, but to be here as it happened. I could go. I'm going to limit myself in that because I could go on in response to so many things that were said. As John mentioned, there was a panel like this at the Southern meetings, and my remarks there revolved mainly around how much luck was involved in my career. So many of the good things that happened to me, not least of which was meeting and knowing many of the people who are here, and my attending Rochester, which was in many ways accidental. I guess listening to what everybody said today, I renew that feeling. So I've been very lucky. But how many of the things that people mentioned go back in one way or another to the fact that I attended Rochester and there met so many of the people involved. This is some of my former graduate students have been here, and others were at the the Southern meeting, and I remarked then that me telling stories to them about Rochester was one of the cores of the mentoring process that that went on. So I talked about my collaboration with a number of the people here, the poker game that so many of my students have heard about the poker game at Rochester. There were 8 of us. We would play once a month from 8 p.m. to 6 a.m. And,
I was the mark in that game.
Pardon me?
I was the mark in that game.
God, I think all of us felt we were the mark in that game from one time to another, and that. You know, the card games in Harkness Hall. So many of these events involved not what seemed on the surface a non-political science activity, but politics and political science were constantly being discussed in the poker games, in the card games, and things like that. So the linkages that were formed in those days were very important. Another aspect is that my experiences as a graduate student and my interactions with my graduate students, colleagues, shaped the way that I tried to approach my dealings with my students and the kinds of things that I tried to bring to their attention and the kinds of the ways in which I approached my reactions to their work. Wendy mentioned that when she was giving her paper at the Midwest, that there was some trepidation because I was her discussant, and she found out that I wasn't too bad. And part of the reason I wasn't too bad is I went through a very similar experience myself, except my first discussant was Anthony Downs. And Anthony Downs, of course, was he approached being a discussant the way other economists approach being discussants. And so it was a less positive experience for me than it was Wendy's experience with me was. But you know, I learned from that. The willingness of Dick Fenno to spend an ungodly amount of hours listening to me talk to him in his office, and that shaped the way that I tried to interact with my graduate students, and the whole set of relationships that were formed in Rochester formed the bedrock for the way PIPSI was created and the way it was run, and I believe its tremendous success. And so that's very much on my mind as I react to this. Another aspect of this same thing is as Mo and Ken and John have talked about. I mean, there are the 4 of us. We've been friends for more than half a century as a group, and that is an unbelievable kind of experience that I don't know anybody else who's shared that kind of experience in their professional life, and the continuous interaction, the Fenno dinner that Ken mentioned, and that the most recent Fenno dinner was held at the APSA meetings in Washington, and we were all there and participated in that. So I am grateful that I was fortunate enough to go to Rochester. I'm grateful that I had these great friendships that have lasted so long, and these professional collaborations. Each of us has co-authored together. It's been a wonderful experience, and while it is certainly true that I feel that I'm ready to retire. I'm about as ready to retire as it's possible to be. I am not ready for these friendships and interactions to end. And I do hope that they carry on for a very, very long time in the future. So thanks again to all of you. And Sean, I turn the control back to you. And
Great. Thanks, Dave, for those nice words. I think that we're all a little bit envious of the nature of the relationship that you share with that whole Rochester crew. So, there are lots of people who've been very patiently waiting to say their 2 bits on Dave, and so I now invite you. I think that it's possible for you to raise your hand, and if you just wait until I call on you, and then unmute yourself, and then say what you'd like to say. Not all at once. All right, go ahead, Linda.
So I'd like to say hi to everybody. John Aldrich and I entered in the same entering class at Rochester, and Dave, Mo, and Ken were a very imposing set of older graduate students. I wasn't myself a Congress scholar, at least not from the beginning. It took me quite a few decades to see the light. And eventually I evolved in that direction. And I grew to appreciate Dave's work as I learned more and more about the Congress as an institution. I haven't actually been a Congress scholar until just my last project, where I did indeed go to Congress. I interviewed members of Congress. Last summer, I was invited to testify before a Senate subcommittee. So now I've had the full Congress experience, I think. And I am very impressed by both Dave and John's work. It really is very important in my current research, and it has been for some time. I think they made very important theoretical, intellectual contributions. But I also want to say, along with everybody else, that Dave is just a really nice guy. And so have a very happy and enjoyable retirement, and please do keep in touch with all of us.
thank you, Linda.
Thanks, Linda. So Jan Box-Effensmeyer's up next.
Hi, everyone. It's so great to see you. And it's actually something I think I really needed just intellectually to see all of you. I've been having a great time seeing my OSU colleagues, of course, but it's nice to get together with such a vibrant intellectual community that Dave has had a major impact on. But I also want to reiterate how much impact he's had in ways that I'm sure he doesn't realize. So Renee Smith is one of my early co-authors and good friends. And so any advice that Dave gave to Renee as one of his graduate students inevitably came to me, which inevitably means is still being passed on to my graduate students, including one of Sean's colleagues now at UT Austin. I placed my first graduate student back at my alma mater last year, so I couldn't, well, maybe it's been longer than that, it went so fast, but Allison Craig. And one of those pieces of advice was actually hinted on by John Aldrich, but it came to me as, make sure you have some outside interests, you're going to be more productive. And so I, when we were going through the roundtable, when Wendy was asking about, the flip of the Senate, my thought was we should all check in on what do we do outside of political science, because you get fascinating answers about what people do. And so I just want to say to Dave, thank you for the intellectual contribution that you've provided to this wonderful political science discipline that we all love, but also just to let you know that there are so many people who are touched by your advice that you have no idea that has really helped them in personal ways to achieve a lot of success in this profession. So thank you, and can't wait to hear what retirement brings. I think we're all looking for what are those retirement models out there to still stay engaged.
Thank you, Jan.
So next up is Craig Bolden.
Congrats, Dave. Your work has been an inspiration to many of us over the years, but when Alan and I were putting together our center, we really looked to PIPSI to see what could be done and what sort of contributions you all had made over the years and what we could model after. It's been a delight to be in a profession that has an example set by such great folks we're hearing from today. Really puts the responsibility on all of us, as Wendy was suggesting, to carry that forward. But easy to do that when we have such a great model. So thanks again, Rohde.
And I feel awful for doing this because poor Alan always has to come after Volden, and that's just not fair. And so, but Alan was next to chime in, so Alan, you're up.
Even though I swear we typed at the same time, I don't know how that worked out.
Alphabetical, Alan, alphabetical.
I know, I got to find, that's why Jack writes and I still write together. At least I have someone below me. Well, listen, David, just congratulations on everything. I mean, it's so great seeing everyone and having a chance to connect with you in this way. And thanks so much to Sean for reaching out to all of us. In listening to everyone's testimony, I was thinking back to the first time I had a chance to really spend time with you, and this hopefully dovetails nicely with some of Wendy's thoughts. But when I flew in for an interview at Michigan State in December of 2000, I touched down around 3:30 in the afternoon, but it was still just completely dark outside. And you picked me up at the airport, so we went out for dinner. I believe we had some sort of white fish on a plank with some potato. It was very Midwest. I mean, growing up in the Midwest, this is like still very Midwestern. But I was really impressed by your wine knowledge. It really complemented the white fish very nicely. And then that morning you picked me up for breakfast and we got into a really nice discussion about your experience authoring the Subcommittee Bill of Rights. And it just really struck me, being someone who's finishing up a graduate program. You know, you were someone who, obviously I knew a lot about your theoretical contributions to the discipline, but I walked away thinking, boy, this is a guy that actually knows stuff. I mean, he knows facts. He actually knows things. And it just struck me at the time, this is really a model of scholarship to emulate, someone who makes some really important theoretical and scholarly contributions, but is still very well grounded in what's going on in the real world. And it's something that I know I and Craig and other scholars within our cohort and people younger than us have really strived to emulate. And then beyond that, just to really re-articulate points that Wendy started off with. I mean, when I think about the definition of mensch in a textbook, you know, you are really at the top of that list in terms of people who, you know, myself not coming from, you know, maybe like second or third generation removed from Rochester, but not coming from Michigan State or Duke. You know, you had no obvious reason to be as generous as you were with me for all these years. And you and John and everyone's cohort was so forthcoming with your time. And it was just really, really valuable. And once again, it's a great model to emulate for people in our cohort and cohorts below us and the way we interact with students and junior scholars. So thank you for your time.
Thank you, Alan.
Steve Smith gets the microphone next.
Oh, well, congratulations, Dave. It doesn't seem possible that you're going to retire this year. Tell me it's not true. You can still change your mind, right?
No.
Oh, please, please, please. Well, your scholarship is going to be remembered forever. It's absolutely amazing. But let me just emphasize what others have touched on. You mentioned Dick Fenno as a great mentor and the great group you had at Rochester when you were there. But you've set a model for all of us in creating a followership among graduate students and getting people to think both theoretically and substantively about an institution that's so important. The graduate students you've trained has at both Michigan State and at Duke has now filled the ranks of congressional scholars, and you're one of just a very few people who have really kept an important field of scholarship going, keep with important innovations that influence so many other parts of political science. So let me just plug how important it's been that you've served as a model for us all in training graduate students. And we'll keep seeing you around.
Thank you, Steve.
You're welcome.
Next up is Karen McCurdy.
Okay. Hi, Dave. I just wanted to echo all of the sentiments that have been mentioned this morning. I met Dave at the SPSA when he was in line to be the president, and that's a very, very long 8-year commitment that the SPSA made. And I was executive director for the last year. My last year as executive director was the year that Dave was president. And I don't know if he realized how much he was helping me learn how to be a good administrator. And I took away the sense that your research, your family, and your students are the most important thing that we do. And I was at a career crossroads when I met Dave, and he really did help me figure out the priorities that I had. And he was one of the first senior political scientists that I was around who was willing to be so forthcoming about how important family and students were in being a professional political scientist. And I really want to thank him for that sense.
Thank you, Karen.
All right, I'm gonna, an outsider, a self-admitted outsider, William Heller wanted to say a few words. No, you're on mute, William.
Thank you. Sorry about that. I don't remember when I met Dave Rohde. And my career, my education, my career was sort of Rohde adjacent. But at the same time, I mean, first of all, I mean, somewhere along the line, I met him, and he, along with some of the other senior scholars present, sort of impressed me as being, you know, I'd meet them at conferences and they would talk to me when I was a grad student and have nice things to say, and we'd chat, and it was sort of nice to be recognized as a human. And you know, quite frankly, and I'll echo Ken Wiseman here a little bit, the theoretical work grounded in the real world has always served as a very strong, if you like, ambition of mine to sort of do that kind of work. And you know, quite frankly, the stuff I've read by you over the years, and again, sort of had seeped into my education as bits of other things, has been very influential in how I think about political parties and legislatures. And so, I mean, I don't think I could do sort of be the political scientist I am. And I'm not sure if I were, you know, I'm not sure I'd even want to be a political scientist if I hadn't sort of had that kind of scholarship to build on and to work from. So I'm an admiring outsider, I think, is I'm glad to have been able to know you over the years, and I now feel really, really bad that I didn't send you stuff somewhere along the line. Everyone else has done it. But yeah, thanks. It's been good to know you, and it's been good to read your stuff.
Thanks a lot, Will.
So she didn't ask for the microphone, but I'm going to see if Barb wants to say anything. Do you want to say anything, Barb? And if you do, I'll unmute you. You're unmuted.
Yeah, I've been making notes as I go along here. Just thought I'd spend a couple of minutes in history. I met Dave in 1963. It's probably before a lot of you were born. Dave was 19 years old. We were married in 67. And we shared, and in 1967, on our honeymoon, I might add, Dave tried to teach me how to play bridge. Wasn't very successful. I'm a terrible bridge player, but he found himself some other partners, so that's great. We shared our Rochester years with Mo and Mary and John and Cindy and Ken and Risa. Dave and I shared many years of raising kids together and teaching and traveling, and you can see our children here. He's been extremely supportive of me in my endeavors. Many of the years that I was at Michigan State with him were working years. And now that I'm not, quote, working, he's sharing my art years and very supportive. When Dave was 60 years old, which we figured was quite old, we surprised Dave with a party that he wasn't aware of. Maggie and Jenny and I cooked it up, and Ken and Risa were there, and Mo, I'm sorry, Cindy, of course, and Dave, and we gave him a wonderful notebook full of great pictures and his life, and I've been adding to it. So a lot of you wrote letters to Dave, and those are in the notebook. So he can go and read those whenever he wants. And anytime anything ever happened to Dave, I put it in the notebook. It's getting quite thick. So that's all I wanted to say. But as you can see, Dave's got Bogey next to him right there. And while we didn't get to go to England or Stratford or Ann Arbor this year, but we'll always have Paris.
Thank you, babe.
Thanks, Barb. So I'm going to give the last two words to Maggie, who asked for the microphone, and then Dave, I'll give him final word. Before I turn it over, though, I did want to note that Chuck Finicaro wishes that he could chime in. Unfortunately, in the crazy world in which we live, there's a clarinet lesson happening at his house right now, and so he's unsure if he can compete with the noise coming out of that. And what I'll say, just in my final words, is what's clear to me is that, Dave, your scholarship is both impeccable and noteworthy. But what is truly what I'm going to take away from this is that you are the epitome of what it means to be both a scholar and a good person. And for that, I'm just grateful. And with that, I'll turn over to Maggie, and then Maggie, straight from Maggie to Dave.
I'll be brief. I'm coming from Michigan, where it is currently blizzarding. We have 3 inches of snow. It is unexpected and terrible. We will be glad that you are in North Carolina. Well, I first met Dave 46 years ago. His involvement in politics largely went over my head when I was growing up. I watched him listening to the news and reading the newspaper every morning with a sense of annoyance. And I have vivid memories of the many phone calls and interviews that you would get during election years. I remember you giving me a copy of the early editions of Change and Continuity. Got one here, which is signed to me, which, I was curious about the whole thing, and Parties and Leaders is the first edition. So, I really didn't know what those meant at that time, and I had no sense of what was in them. I just knew that you made them, and my name was in them, and that made them cool. And I had a vague sense of your career. When I was a student at Michigan State, I got to see you frequently, being there for 5 years together. That, I think, taught me the value of professional and personal community. And that really impacted my quality of life going forward, even after you moved to Florida and then later to North Carolina. So my dad, as Alan says, is a guy who knows stuff, and is a really nice guy. And those are the 2 things that were the most important to me growing up. I never got a lot of impact about how to manage my educational career. You always supported me in whatever I did, even if it was weird. And many of the life lessons that John Aldrich mentioned are ones that I internalized as well. But I will say that the most important one that I learned from my dad was to love people first for their inherent value and way above their actions or accomplishments. And I think everybody who knows you feels that way. Like they know that you feel that way about them. I have never questioned my dad's acceptance of me as a parent, as a friend. And after being an elementary educator for 20 years and a parent for 14, I will say that there are not too many kids in the world who can feel that way. So I'm grateful for those things. Thanks, Dad.
Thank you, Maggie. And also please thank Newton for stopping by and meowing behind
There's
you.
lots of comments, yes.
Well, I'll just echo what I said earlier, and thank you all for so much. This has just been absolutely wonderful. As important as my work has been to me, and it has certainly been important, even more important is the friendships and relationships and that I've shared with you folks. My closing line at the Southern was that, as virtually all of you know, I think that whatever subject matter you want to say something about, there's something that a movie or a book or a television show can say about it. And for me, it really has been a wonderful life. And so thanks again. Thanks very much.